Good morning, happy Veterans Day, and welcome to Coffee and the Word. You know, I was wondering how I wanted to approach today. Today is Veterans Day, and it's a really good opportunity for us to remember and thank all the people who have served in our armed forces, our military. I am very grateful that we live in a country where our military is a volunteer military. People choose to fight for this country, and I'm very grateful to that. I'm very grateful that people have made that choice. The scripture says, "No greater love hath a man than this, than to lay down his life for his friends," and I'm sure that the people who have served over the last several years, especially, realize that they were serving in a volatile time, and yet they signed up anyway. We have some of our church members who are serving currently, and I just want to thank you. And we have church members who've served in the past, and I want to thank you. Your service is not unnoticed. I believe you should be honored. I believe you should be thanked. I hope today you recognize that there are Americans who appreciate the sacrifices you've made. And I just want you to know I'm one of them. So thank you, veterans. Thank you for all that you've done. And thank you for those of you who are still doing it. Thank you for what you're doing. But this is Coffee and the Word, so I want to jump into a text. In fact, I titled this Coffee and the Word, "Are We More Merciful Than God?" And so we're gonna stay true to our text. We're in Genesis chapter 18, and God and two angels had just come to see Abraham and reminded him that he was going to have a son with Sarah, and that he was going to be a great nation. And Sarah laughed at these men. Sarah laughed at God, and we talked about that yesterday. So if you missed that, go catch that. But as these men are getting ready to leave, they start walking towards Sodom. And I know you know this story. You know about these men, or you know about God's judgment on Sodom, but you may not know this part. As we get down toward the end of the chapter, it says, I'm sorry, I lost my spot. When the men got up to leave, verse 16, they looked down towards Sodom, and Abraham walked along with them to see them on their way. Then the Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do?" And I love this. Before I go any further, I love that God has this moment. Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? And then listen to what God's rationale is. He says, Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all nations of the earth will be blessed through him. For I have chosen him so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just. So the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he has promised. Then the Lord said, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin is so grievous, that I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will know. And so, God says, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? And then the scripture says God's going to go check and see. He's going to go see if the outcry is bad. And I've often wondered, where's that outcry coming from? But evil has a tendency to harm. And I think we need to recognize that evil hurts people. Evil damages lives. Evil destroys lives. Evil is not something that is able to stay contained, if you will. Once evil is out, evil is destructive for so many. And so God says, I'm going to go check it out. I'm going to go see what's going on, and then I'm going to do what needs to be done. And then Abraham approached him and said, Lord, will you sweep away the righteous and the wicked? And I got to give Abraham some credit here, because Abraham is going to God and he's willing to address God on this matter. He's like, will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? But I want to talk about that a little bit, because Abraham should know God a little better, I think, by now. I think Abraham has a tendency to forget who God is many times throughout his life. When he gets up and he leaves and he heads towards this promised land that God will show him, when he goes into Egypt, he lies about who his wife is, because he really doesn't, deep down, he doesn't think that God is able to fulfill what God has said. And so he's worried about being killed, when instead he should have known that God was going to protect him. So that's one example of of Abraham not really knowing God, right? He doesn't realize what God is capable. A little bit later, when his wife comes to him and says, well, we need some kids. In order for you to be a great nation, you got to be a dad. So take my wife, take my handmaid Hagar, and again Abraham falls into that as well, because he doesn't know who God is, and at least completely. And then a little bit later, when the men come to him, Abraham is like, "Yeah, I'm an old man," and Sarah laughs at God, and all of that happens. So over and over and over again, we find Abraham not really operating towards God as if he is God. In other words, he doesn't really understand who God is. And I think we fall into this trap all the time. And I think his question here, will you wipe away the righteous with the wicked, is one of those times when you don't really know who God is. And we have a tendency, I run into people all the time who want to put God on trial. How can you be a believer how can you serve a God who was willing to wipe out an entire world through the flood? How can you serve a God who's willing to wipe out an entire people? In fact, there's this movement that says that anybody who believes in the Old Testament God believes in a genocidal maniac. And I'm just telling you that when you study the full narrative of God, that's not who you're going to meet. You're not going to meet a God who is a genocidal, narcissistic maniac. You're going to meet a God who is full of mercy and compassion, who's full of love, but also full of justice. And justice is something we don't talk enough about. God looked down upon Sodom and Gomorrah, and justice needed to be rendered, because, as I said before, wickedness doesn't happen in isolation. Wickedness has victims. And so when God said, the scripture says that the outcry against Sodom has come to my ears. In other words, there is some problems here. And so he's going to destroy it. And then Abraham asks, will you wipe away the wicked with the righteous? And then he goes, what if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous people? Far be it from you to do such a thing. To kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike, far be it from you. Will you not judge? Will not the judge of all the earth do right? And so, by the way, if I'm God, I'm not as patient with Abraham as God is, because I don't like to be accused of being something I'm not. I try to tell people all the time, if you're going to make an accusation against me, consider the totality of my existence. Like, don't make an accusation against me about something that is outside of my character. Like, I have developed and I have worked hard on being a person of a certain character. And so when an accusation comes against me by someone else, I tend to hope, or I do hope, that before you decide to hear the accusation, you'll consider the totality of my character. And I feel that way about God and Abraham here. Is Abraham's just like, will you really do that? Like, are you that guy? And so when Abraham approaches God, I love that God is patient enough to show Abraham who he is and be who he is. And so here's what he says. He says, now Abraham spoke, the Lord said, if I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their sake. The title in my Bible says, Abraham intercedes for Sodom. And I guess in a sense that's happening here. But he started by saying, I'm going to go down and see if the outcry is what it says it is, and I will know. And now we get to this point, and Abraham says, will you not for 50 righteous people spare the whole place? And he's like, yes, of course I will. For 40, of course I will. For 30, of course I will. And then Abraham gets all the way down to 10. And he says, yeah, if there are 10 righteous people, I will spare the whole place for those 10. I am not going to wipe out the righteous with the wicked. And so I just want to point this out because I do believe that we have a tendency to love to put God on trial. And we usually put God on trial through our own bias. When we hear stories about God and Job, we put God on trial. When we hear stories about God and Jonah, we put God on trial. We hear stories about God and the Canaanites, we put God on trial. And as we go through Scripture, we tend to be like, well, God's kind of mean, or God's kind of evil, or God's kind of fill in the blank. And I just want you to understand that it is not our... if we're going to put God on trial, we must acknowledge the totality of his character. And God is a God of mercy and of love. God is a God of grace. God is a God who has, throughout the history of time, found reasons not to destroy us instead of looking for reasons to destroy us. And what's interesting about that is the whole time he does this, he has to balance the fact that wickedness destroys righteousness. It has a tendency to permeate it. And so he's got to balance that. And so I love that Abraham shows that he has a mercy in his heart for a people like we do. But God's mercy is greater than that. And so I just want to encourage you, if you're going to put God on trial, consider the totality of his character before you do it. And what you'll find is God is far more gracious than you, far more merciful than you, far more loving than you, but he's also far more just than you. And we have to look at the totality of his character. And so are we more merciful than God? The answer is absolutely not. We are definitively not more merciful than God. I know I went a little long today, so I'm going to shut it down here. I just wanted you to see that before we get into the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. We'll do that tomorrow. Again, happy Veterans Day to everybody. Today has been another edition of Coffee and the Word. God bless. I hope you have a great day.